Stankovich, the Associate Vice Provost for Undergraduate Education and Director of the Center for Teaching and Learning, which sponsors this series. I hope that you've noticed that there will be 2 more talks next quarter in the series. Today we have the second and last talk in this quarter. And so I hope you've all noticed those talks next quarter will be on May 12th by Professor Mark Applebaum of Music, and on May 26th by Professor Lanier Anderson, who is currently back at Harvard on a visiting professorship from philosophy. So we look forward to seeing you there. Today, we are very fortunate to have political science professor Coit Blacker, who goes by Chip, and who is director of the Stanford Institute for International Studies, talking to us about an experience that changed his life. And while you might assume that this experience would be highlighting his intense and exciting fields of diplomacy and international security, the focus is instead on teaching, and in particular, Sophomore College, which makes it a perfect topic for our series. And as I mentioned to Chip, I've been very, very curious to hear about this experience, so I'm delighted the time has finally come. Now, as I've looked over his CV, however, in order to prepare this introduction, I couldn't help noticing that this is a man who has spent his adult life in some of the most rarefied circles of international security and arms control, and yet someone who has chosen again and again to come back to campus and to make a very deep commitment to students and a personal kind of education for them. He is a truly outstanding example of the kind of scholar who makes Stanford such a unique place. He received his bachelor's degree in political science in 1972 from Occidental College, making both Phi Beta Kappa and cum laude. From there, he went on to the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, earning a master's degree in international relations in '73, a master's degree in law and diplomacy in 1975, and a PhD in international relations in 1978. He then became assistant director and research associate at the Arms Control and Disarmament Program here at Stanford. In 1981, he left to become special assistant for national security affairs to Senator Gary Hart. Coming back to Stanford in 1982 as associate director and senior research associate to the renamed Center for International Security and Arms Control, or CSAC. In '98, he departed the campus again for 3 years, this time to the Peace and Conflict Studies program at USC, returning to CSAC in 1991. He then left Stanford again in 1995-96, this time to serve as special assistant to the President of the United States for National Security Affairs. He returned to campus in 1997 and since 2003 has been director of our Institute for International Studies. Along the way, he's written or edited 7 books and many book chapters, reports, and articles. He has also been honored with numerous awards, including an International Affairs Fellowship from the Council of Foreign Relations in New York and an honorary doctorate from the Far Eastern Institute of the Russian Academy of Sciences. And yet, he has also found the time and the dedication to make the kind of extraordinary contribution to our students' learning that earned him in 2001 the Hoagland Prize for Undergraduate Teaching, and in 2002 designation as the Olivier Nomellini Family University Fellow in Undergraduate Education. Welcome, Professor Blacker, and we're eager to hear about your Sophomore College experience.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you all for finding the time in the course of your busy day to come and hear me talk about Sophomore College, which is actually what this talk is about. A couple of weeks ago, I got an email from Sherry Palmer asking me if I wanted to teach again in Sophomore College, specifically a course that's called American Foreign Policy in the 21st Century. And I think I had taught it, I think, five times, Sherry. I think starting, what, 98? I don't even remember. It seems, okay. So I think this would be the sixth time, I think, if I teach it, something like that. So I stared at the computer monitor and thought, you really can't this time, okay? You just can't. You've got too much to do. There's a lot going on at the Stanford Institute for International Studies. There's a lot going on in terms of international studies more broadly at Stanford. I was thinking to myself, you'll be sorry, you can skip a year, you know, what's the big deal here? There are lots of other offerings. Sherry and her staff have done a wonderful job in putting together a great collection of courses. As Nancy Reagan would say, just say no, okay? It's just that simple. You just can't do it this year. So I clicked on reply and I responded to Sherry. Dear Sherry, I'd like nothing more than to teach again in SOCO, but I just can't this time. I've got too many other things going on, maybe next year. But when I went to hit the send button, my fingers wouldn't cooperate. They just were kind of stuck over the keyboard. And so I tried again and thought, you can do this, you can do this. Just press the send button and Sherry will get the message. Nothing. So I thought for a moment and I said to myself, who are you kidding? So I erased the message and I wrote to Sherry, yes, of course I'll teach the course if you'll have me again. It's a true story. So what is it about SOCO that turns me into putty in Sherry Palmer's hands? Or that saps my will and compels me to do the very thing that I promised myself I wouldn't do this coming academic year? Well, maybe I'm just a really weak person. I don't often think in those terms, but it's certainly a possibility, I suppose. But let me offer up three other explanations for why I teach in Sophomore College, when I should probably be doing other things, that I find more compelling in terms of their explanatory power, and certainly less frightening to me personally. So, first, if you teach in Sophomore College, you get to choose the students who end up enrolling in the class. And you get to limit the enrollment to 12 students. Or, if you're feeling generous, as Sherry made me feel last year, we bumped it to 14. So if you teach, and there are lots of people in this room who teach, you know this is a special treat. This is a great luxury. When it comes to teaching, small really is better. I mean, I don't mind teaching large lecture courses. I've done that my entire career at Stanford, and or seminars. That's all fine. But the seminars are usually large. They're usually 16 to 20. So the notion of having just 12 students is extremely attractive. Now, in my case, the number of applicants typically ranges between 100 and 150 students each year. So remember, we're talking about Stanford students here to begin with. To state the obvious then, it's a fantastic pool from which to draw. So first reason why I teach in Sophomore College is because you just have this kind of extraordinary capacity to handpick the students. The second reason is that the students self-select. To put it mildly, the vast majority of applicants, and I'm sure this is true for all Sophomore College classes, I know it's true for mine, are highly motivated. These students are highly motivated, and this too is a gigantic plus. They know, among other things, that admission to my course hinges on the persuasiveness of their application. I don't see transcripts, which I think is smart. You guys don't do transcripts for any of these, right? It's just the application, and it's the essay. So everything turns on the essay, and they know that they've got one chance in 5 or 10 or something like that of being admitted to the course. So they take time with these applications. They invest considerable time and energy in putting their best foot forward. So the applications are, for the most part, not a big surprise, a joy to read. One of the best essays that I've ever received was by an applicant from my SOCO class of 2000 who wrote, quote, "I have two passions in life, sex and American foreign policy." Since Sophomore College doesn't offer a class on sex, my decision was an easy one. He got in, by the way. Very smart kid, very smart kid. I spend hours and hours and hours selecting the students for admission. And getting from the strongest 25 students to the best 12 to 15 is basically a nightmare. And the one good thing about this otherwise agonizing process is that I know the students pretty well before I ever meet them. That is, they track with their applications. As soon as they say their name, because they spend so much time with these applications, I know who the student is, and I know what they're writing about, and I know what preoccupies them. In essence, then, we get to hit the ground running when the course starts, which is good for them and obviously good for me. Third reason is that both sides in this equation, that is, their faculty tour guide, which is how I think of myself, and the students, essentially live and breathe this stuff, that is, foreign and defense policy issues. The students in my SOCO class read Foreign Affairs magazine and Foreign Policy magazine and the New York Times and the Washington Post because they want to. And they've done that before they come to class. I don't mean the week before. I mean they've been doing it since they were like freshmen in high school. They argue endlessly, truly endlessly, about the wisdom of this or that policy course without prompting and without central direction. So if I go out of the room and I come back in 5 minutes later, they're talking about foreign policy. I mean, they talk about everything at once, as you all know who teach, but the kind of leitmotif is always some foreign policy issues. In other words, they're just like me. They're totally preoccupied by this stuff. And we get to immerse ourselves in this stuff for a minimum of 2 hours a day, every day, for 2 full weeks. It's actually longer than 2 weeks. The reality is it's more like 4 hours a day if you include meals, if you include special events, and if you include social time, which turns out to be very, very important to the integrity of the sophomore college class experience. I don't routinely invite students or classes into my home, but part of the ritual now is that, 3 or 4 days into it, Louis, we invite them, and they all troop over, and we have, coffee and cookies and all that stuff, so that, they are physically in our home, so that they can see, 1, that we're human beings, 2, that we actually live in like conventional structures, not some place where they keep professors in a pen all day and then let us loose. So it's very, very humanizing. It's very satisfying, the whole experience, for foreign policy weenies like us, and it's an immense amount of fun. So, those are the 3 kind of obvious reasons that come to mind when I think why teaching in sophomore college is a positive experience. There's a 4th reason that I want to underscore, and that is that it's important to me personally. It's important to me at a personal level. I returned from Washington the last time at the end of 1996 after 2 years on staff at the National Security Council at the White House. And among other things that struck me when I came home, and there were a number of things that struck me when I came home, was the fact that we offered no courses on U.S. foreign policy at Stanford. There was no course called U.S. foreign policy or the foreign policy of the United States. There were some courses that were tangentially linked. There was no kind of core undergraduate offering entitled U.S. foreign policy. Now, this was especially surprising to me, as you all know, because we offer courses on just about everything else at this place, including some that it would be a stretch for me to regard as having equal merit. And I don't mean to downplay what is taught here by anyone. It just struck me because acquainting students with foreign policy issues strikes me as quite central to the educational process of students who have an interest in the world beyond our borders. So I thought at the time that this was a bit absurd, given the manifest student interest in the topic, not to mention its objective importance. So in response to this gap in our curricular offerings, I did 2 things. First, I created a graduate seminar on decision-making in U.S. foreign policy, which I try to teach every spring and which I very, very much enjoy teaching. Second, I accepted an invitation from the folks who run introductory studies at Stanford to put together the same type of course for rising sophomores, which is, as I've noted, entitled American Foreign Policy in the 21st Century. Now, I think of this course, the Sophomore College course, as a kinder and gentler version of the graduate seminar or foreign policy for toddlers or something like that. So part of the appeal of SOCO, I now recognize, is that it allows me to get at some of Stanford's best and brightest, our smartest and most highly motivated undergraduates early on in their careers, rather like an academic cradle robber, which enables me to channel and direct their energy and their passion in a productive way far earlier than otherwise would have been the case. I typically, in the course of my career at Stanford, typically I have taught upper division undergraduate courses or graduate seminars. So by the time I get them, prior to SOCO, they were either juniors or seniors. So one of the things that I found especially appealing about SOCO was that I caught them right at the start of their sophomore year. So they've basically only been at Stanford 3 quarters. And then they roll in, as you know, right after Labor Day, and then I have them for about 2.5 weeks. So this is also very, very satisfying. And this is, I suspect, what motivates me above all else to teach in Sophomore College. It affords me the opportunity to acquaint these wonderfully gifted, if still imperfectly formed, Stanford students with the extraordinary complexity of the issues before us in the foreign policy realm, while at the same time beginning to equip them with the tools that I think they're going to need to be effective and, as I said, productive in dealing with these challenges down the line. Now, I tease them that they're so very opinionated on the issues that we contend with in class because they know so little about them. That is to say, there's an inverse relationship between their passion with respect to a particular issue set and generally their knowledge. Right? So what you don't know about, you just feel passionately about, and you hope to persuade everyone in the room by the depth of your passion. Now, I know that they've learned something, that we've learned something valuable when their arguments become much more nuanced and much more on the one hand, on the other hand, than they were at the beginning of our sojourn together. I know that we're getting somewhere when they respond to one of my queries with, that's a really tough question. Or, my favorite, I don't know the answer to that question. Let me think about it for a minute. The first time I hear that, I know it's like bingo, all right? You know, we're making real progress here because their mouths are not engaged before their brains are, right? They're actually taking a moment to think about the complexity of this particular issue, gather their thoughts, and then advance an argument. I always feel like ordering up a fireworks display when I get that answer for the first time in SOCO. So this all makes sense, at least to me. I teach in SOCO because it's fun. I teach in SOCO because it's rewarding. I teach in SOCO because it's a unique experience. But there are a lot of other things that I used to do but stopped doing because I no longer have the time, like trying to finish my book on the rise and fall of U.S.-Russian relations in the 1990s, which I started in 1998 and which sits half-baked, literally, in a folder in my laptop computer. So why is it different with SOCO? Why can't I just let go of it, get over it, and move on? Why has it become so important to me? And I've actually thought a lot about this because it's just been a really, really interesting experience, a very interesting voyage. Now, I've always enjoyed teaching. It doesn't matter if it's lecture courses or seminars or colloquia or tutorials. I believe that teaching is an important calling. I believe it's a noble profession, all of those things. I further believe that any job worth doing, it's a truism, but I happen to believe it, including teaching, is worth doing well. Fine. So I get a lot of satisfaction from the teaching that I've done, and I always have, but it wasn't something about which I felt especially passionate. It was an important part of my job at Stanford, no question about that, but teaching has never been the end-all or the be-all to who I am professionally. I mean, it's a nice piece of it, it's a nice part of it, but, you know, when I was 18 years old and graduating from college, I didn't say, I want to be a teacher. when I was 22, and I didn't say, I want to be a teacher. When I was working on my PhD, I was not thinking, I'm doing this because I really want to be a teacher. I was doing it because I wanted to generate a PhD on Soviet security policy in Europe because I thought it was an interesting topic. And I thought, well, I'll probably end up at a university somewhere because they're the only places that indulge these types of obsessions. But I never thought, but I have to do this because I'm a gifted teacher, because I have a gift to pass along. Never occurred to me. But SOCO is different. It really is, and I'm drawn to it. I'm drawn to it like a moth to a flame. And I've just kind of needed to figure out what's going on here, which is why when CTL asked me to do this, it actually didn't take me very long to figure out what the topic was because I knew it would help me kind of think through why I keep doing this. So what's going on here? Two things, I think, above and beyond the four that are obvious. One has to do with me, I think, and the second has to do with the students. I started teaching when I was 28. I was only marginally older than most of my students when I delivered my first formal lecture at Stanford, which actually was in Terman Auditorium, where I still teach. I swear it's the same podium. It's been there that long. And for me, I have to say, at 28, it really wasn't much fun. I had no clear or well-formed idea what I was doing. In those days, there were no classes on how to be a good teacher when you came out of graduate school. You just stood up and did it, literally. And you made it up as you went along, and you hoped for the best. And it was hard, and it was humbling, and it was nerve-wracking. And in short, at least for me, the early years were pretty terrifying. I mean, if I could have gotten away with, a shot of vodka before standing up in front of a class, I probably would have done it just to settle my nerves. It was really nerve-wracking. Then came the great middle years, 35 to 45, and I enjoyed very much leaving behind kind of the older brother syndrome or the older brother image, which I think, as I look back on it, complicated my efforts to be a good teacher. There was a competitive edge with very young faculty and advanced undergrads. There's a kind of a competitive edge because you're not that much older than they are, and you have to kind of demonstrate that you're at the head of the class for a reason. And so sometimes it can be a little edgy, in particular if you have a cantankerous student. By the time you're in your mid-30s or mid-40s, none of that is going on, obviously. And being closer in age to their parents than I was to them by this point in time, my students treated me differently, and I them. So my role changed. What I did outside the classroom with my students, most especially during my office hours in those days, became no less important than the physical act of teaching. And it was at this juncture that I began to understand what it meant to be a mentor to students rather than just a teacher. And I felt better about what I was doing and how I was doing it. Now, in my 50s, still kind of catches when I say that, but now in my 50s, with 25 years of classroom experience behind me, as well as 2 tours in government, it's still about teaching and it's still about mentoring, but it's also about preparing my students to face the future. A future that is bewilderingly complex, one that is full of opportunity, but also temptation and danger. It's not just about knowledge, though that remains at the core of my efforts, as it must. It's also about character and judgment and integrity and humility. It's about doing the right thing and leading a moral life. It's about being good and productive citizens. It's about respecting differences and embracing diversity. It's about accepting responsibility for one's own actions and, on occasion, for the actions of others. And, as always with me, it's about being effective in everything they do. Now, curiously, the glue that makes this work, at least in my SOCO class, is the course content. What I'm offering up for 2 hours every day during the first 2 weeks in September is something the students in my SOCO class already care about, as I've said. What I'm giving them is what they want from me, and vice versa. I'm interacting with students who already get it, who understand and importantly, who understand the implicit bargain here. I'll share whatever knowledge and experience I have with you, but in exchange, you must accept the responsibility that goes along with it, especially the obligation to think critically and to act responsibly. Which brings me to the second point. I've taught at Stanford long enough to know that the rhetoric has content. Namely, as teachers at this great and august institution, we are helping to educate tomorrow's leaders. Now, this always, throughout my career, has sounded sickeningly sweet to me, just totally sappy, just having no content whatsoever except a kind of a feel-good message. Until I realized in a kind of epiphany one day that it's true. My former students now populate the executive branch, the legislative branch, the judicial branch in the U.S. government. They're peopled around most of the major international organizations, from the United Nations to the World Bank and the IMF, kind of pick your institution. And by this point in my life, and literally dozens of foreign ministries around the world. I have no idea how or precisely when this happened, by the way. I mean, one day they're sitting in class trying to start a sentence at the appropriate place, as opposed to where they usually start them, which is somewhere in the middle. The next day, it seems to me, I'm visiting them in some plush office on the 7th floor of the State Department or some well-appointed suite in the West Wing of the White House. The key thing here is that they know it. They understand that this is going to happen, which both mobilizes them and, for me, certainly enriches the classroom experience. So, in teaching SOCO kids, I know I'm helping to train the next generation. It's right here. It's not some distant notion. I know it and they know it. So while it's fun, it's also deadly serious business. When I tell them that in 10 or 15 years they will be making or shaping policy, they know I'm not snowing them. They know I'm not making this up. They know I'm not feeding them a line. They believe it in part because they see it. They have seen it and they see it literally over and over again. So if my enthusiasm about SOCO sounds like missionary zeal, it's because it is. I know where these kids are headed. I know where they're going to end up. I know what roles they're going to play, and I'm immensely grateful for the opportunity to have a point where I cross over with them at Stanford. Along the way, as they get from here to there, I want them to understand the true dimensions of the challenges that they are going to face. I want them to be equipped with the tools that will ensure their success. I want them to be profoundly and continuously aware of the morally ambiguous domain within which they will be operating. I want them to welcome responsibility, to use their authority wisely, to remain true to the values and convictions that give life meaning and consequence. I want them to appreciate the importance of a life well and justly lived. And I want them to make me and my colleagues at this extraordinary university proud of them for who they are or who they have become, and not for what they have acquired. In this context, I just want to take one moment to talk about my SOCO class of 2001, or as I refer to them and as we refer to one another, the class of 9/11. What cemented my relation with Sophomore College, which was already quite strong, was watching how these 12 kids dealt with the tragedy on September 11th, of which they were all a part. The level of maturity that I saw that day, both in dealing with the unfolding tragedy and in taking care of one another, was simply stunning and made an enormous and a lasting impression upon me. Maybe it would have been the same with students in other courses that I teach, but I doubt it. These kids understood instantly the gravity of the moment, and together, literally, we began to work our way through it. Needless to say, it lent a note of urgency and authenticity to everything we did thereafter in that class, and it created a bond that links us all to this day. Of course, teaching is always about such things, but by its very nature, SOCO intensifies the experience, it concentrates it, it purifies it, it enriches it, and ultimately, as a consequence, it transforms it. It's rather like quenching one's thirst. Now, you can do it by sipping water from a glass, which is the way most people quench their thirst. Or you can do it by trying to drink out of a fire hose. Now, the former, that is, trying to quench one's thirst by sipping out of a cup, certainly works and it gets the job done, but it's pretty tame stuff and it's pretty boring. The latter, on the other hand, the fire hose, is intense, challenging, a bit dangerous, a lot of fun, and if you succeed, much more satisfying. So what I can tell you about my experience in sophomore college is that I'll take the fire hose, and I know the student vets of the sophomore classes would join me in that every time. I want to conclude today with an expression of gratitude that is anything but ritualistic to Sherry and her staff, to John Brovman, to his predecessor, Ramon Saldivar, indeed, all the way back to Condi Rice and to Gerhard Casper, to everyone who has had a hand in revolutionizing undergraduate education at Stanford over the course of the last decade, a heartfelt thanks from a member of the faculty. And I mean that. Thanks for the vision, thanks for the creativity, thanks for the imagination, thanks for the hard work, thanks for the determination, and most of all, thanks for your leadership. What you have wrought at Stanford is remarkable in undergraduate education, and much envied and now much imitated, I must tell you, around the country. It's a powerful and a welcome reminder that when championed by talented and committed people, good ideas can overcome the forces of inertia, indifference, and conceit that so often stymie innovation, retard change, and obstruct our vision in education, no less than in other more mundane domains. So thanks to all of you for persevering in this revolution, Sherry, and thank you all for your attention. Thanks. Of course, happy to take any questions anyone might have. Stig.
Thank you for giving us insight. What we really feel the holiness of it. How unique is Stanford of representing higher education in the United States, and how unique is the United States in the world?
That's a good question, Stig. I'd say a couple of things in response to that. One is, as always, there's a marked difference regarding undergraduate education in the United States between that which takes place at kind of the community college and the state college level, at the level of private colleges, small colleges, of which I'm a graduate, and then undergraduate teaching at major American research universities. I mean, they're three qualitatively very, very different enterprises, I think. And I would argue, I would have argued that prior to this kind of revolution that I'm talking about at undergraduate education, in undergraduate education at Stanford, that the best quality education for American undergraduates probably took place at the best, the most selective, small liberal arts colleges, because, you know, classes are small, very high caliber faculty, et cetera, et cetera. Why I've been so struck at what Stanford has been able to do in the last 10 years is they basically created a mechanism for bringing that quality of instruction back into the classroom, so that you have very, very senior faculty who don't have to teach if really they don't want to, and certainly not undergraduates. You have incented, we have figured out ways to incent faculty to get them back into the classroom with undergraduates, and it was probably more a hope than a conviction when they started that there would be something so profoundly attractive about this, even to senior faculty, that the problem would then take care of itself. And that's basically what happened. I mean, it does, it has certainly served to remind me that whatever I do with graduate students, in particular, is all well and good. But as I said, if I can get at them when they're 18 or 19, the ones who self-select and who really want to do this, I can have more of an impact, and I can save them a lot of kind of confusion about what it is they want to do in life. So I know that the way Stanford does this is still the exception and not the rule among peer institutions. But there's a major effort underway at Harvard and elsewhere to re-examine the role of undergraduate education at these places. But it hasn't been done yet, which I think is interesting. So I think Stanford, is that fair, Sherry? I think we're still significantly beyond where our peer institutions are in this.
I think that's right. There are some places that are revisiting. Yale recently is thinking about doing new things too, and Harvard's in the process, but Stanford's a few years ahead.
Yeah, I think so. And in terms of how undergraduates are educated elsewhere, I mean, I only know the places that I know, which are basically in Europe and Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, and I think we're light years ahead in terms of the way we prepare students, in particular, to assume responsibility. This is again, I've thought a lot about this, and this is a huge issue with me. It's just huge, because if you're not willing to accept your responsibility as a citizen in this country, truly, then you're going to be disengaged from the great debates of the time. You're going to give in to kind of content-free argumentation. You're not going to take your responsibilities seriously. And I still think we do a good job in civic education in this country. Frankly, not as well as we did when I was growing up. But, that was a different time. And there's much more of an emphasis now on this when you're much older. I mean, most of these lessons were internalized by the time I was in high school. I mean, I went to school in the 50s and the 60s. We don't do that anymore, partly because I don't think the teachers are rewarded for doing it, and I don't think there's time for them to do it. So we do it later. But that may be part of the reason why I'm so passionate about this, too, because I view this as kind of the last opportunity to grab them before they go out in the world and try to invest them with a sense of responsibility with respect to the major public policy issues of the day. I haven't seen that emphasis anywhere else.
Condy Rice is touring Europe now and kind of stretching out her hand for unity over the Atlantic. Would this be something that America could bring to the party, so to say? If you look on EU, they are trying to develop a European university system.
Right.
But from my point of view, they do it in a very bureaucratic way.
Top down also.
Right.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, this kind of educational reform project within the EU has been underway for a long time. To this point in time, I think its successes are quite modest. On the other hand, one thing that you never have reason to doubt with respect to EU bureaucrats is they will persist until they get it done. And I think at the end of this process, they will have a system that looks much more like the best of the American system. And there are huge problems with ours. I don't mean to suggest otherwise. But this one thing about free inquiry and being aware of one's kind of larger set of responsibilities, I think is a largely American form. And to the extent that the EU reforms lead to that, I think will be a good thing. They've taken some amazing strides, actually, I think. Please.
College sophomores are quite young, and I'm wondering if they have a fairly well-formulated sense of what their career path is going to be, whether it's research and academia or public service or whatever. And does SOCO actually have an impact on their trajectory or which path they take?
Well, Sherry's the expert in the room on this, but I think what brings them to my class is a deep interest in the issues, as I've said. They predominantly come from highly politicized homes where politics is front and center over the dinner table, and arguing about this, that, and the other thing is a primary characteristic. But they are quite unformed in the sense that they don't know what to do with this stuff. They don't know what to do with these interests. And so, the first thing you do is try to help them pick a major. And it's, in some cases, it's very straightforward. It's quite clear to me that they're going to be poli-sci or international relations majors. In other cases, I have kids who are going into mechanical engineering or computer science, and there I try very hard to keep them on that track because there's a reason why they're predisposed toward mechanical engineering, usually because they're very gifted in those things, and I don't want them, because all of a sudden they're caught up in these foreign policy issues, to change course and become an IR major. So those cases are pretty straightforward. And that's probably a majority of the students. But there's some number of them every year who just can't figure out what to do with this stuff. And they are the ones who wait till the last minute to choose their majors. They're the ones who wait till the last possible moment to decide what they're going to do the year after they graduate from college. And they're the ones who tend to get most traumatized by their inability to think farther ahead than a quarter. So part of my job is to calm them down and to tell them, go ahead and get their feet wet. So if you don't know what you want to do when you graduate from Stanford, but you really do care about these issues, go do an internship someplace in Washington or elsewhere. I'll try to help you find a job with Congressman X, or it's not that hard to do. So most of them know what they're doing. Most of them know where they're going. As I said, maybe a third of them have no clear idea, and those are the ones that take the most time and the effort, but in many cases turn out to be the most rewarding because they're kind of late bloomers, not intellectually, but they are in terms of how they develop professionally. Yep.
I'm curious, you talked about how important it was that you could choose the students in your seminar. When you are choosing them, are you looking for students to go along with your theme of responsibility that you maybe think you could most affect in that way? Maybe students who are most unlike you, and maybe you feel you could help them take a different point of view on some of these policy issues? Or what do you find that you most enjoy in the students you decide to pick?
That's a really good question. I look for two things in the essays. Qualities of mind first. What's the kind of intellectual horsepower we're playing with here? Now, all Stanford students are smart. Some are smarter than others, but every Stanford student is capable of performing terrifically in this class. But there are qualities of intellect that will emerge, and maybe it's critical thinking. Maybe it's the ability they have to express themselves clearly, which indicates to me a fairly well-organized mind. So qualities of mind is terribly important. The second is, again, a sense that they have thought through, even in a rudimentary way, their relationship to the world around them. The students who never succeed in getting in are the ones who begin their essays with, "I've always loved foreign cultures." They won't get in. They started the sentence with "I." They used an expressive verb that is so overused as to be deprived of content. And they confused a generalized interest in things beyond the end of their nose with foreign. The students who win are the students like Ari Ratner, who said, it literally started, "I have two obsessions in life. One is sex and the other is American foreign policy." Ari got in, and the whole quality of his essay was played off of that theme. It was very clever, it was very imaginative. He drew parallels between his obsessions, right? He actually explained why he was obsessed and why they were linked and all that stuff. So those two things, kind of firepower, intellectual firepower, a high degree of self-awareness, but no conceit. And the other thing I look for is the kind of richest possible mix I can have of ethnicities, obviously, and gender balance. I think gender balance is very, very important. I can't do 6 and 6 some years, without really being artificial about it. But I can usually get it to 7 to 5, either male or female plurality. But I think that's very, very, very important. I mean, if you get 10 19-year-old men together with 2 19-year-old women in a sophomore college class, with foreign policy being the obsession, the men will hijack it. They will just hijack it. And if there are only 2 women, unless they are extraordinary young women, they will, rather than be unpleasant about it, they will just kind of roll with the tenor. So it turns out to be very, very important in this class to have a pretty close balance. And I try hard, very, very hard to do that. So that's what I look for.
One
Sure,
other
sure.
question. It seems clear that you've discovered things about what makes SOCO so successful for you as a teacher and for the students as learners. Do you feel, having thought a lot about this, that you've been able to bring into your other classes or create in your non-SOCO classes any of the characteristics?
Yes. It has changed the way I teach ordinary seminars now. Not so much lecture courses, because lecture courses are lecture courses. In particular, when there are 150 students or 175 or so. With the seminars, I do something that I've only started to do since I teach sophomore college, since I started teaching sophomore college. I go around the room, and I have everyone introduce themselves slowly by name. And then we do the same thing in reverse. So we start with number 16 instead of number 1. So 16, 15, 14, 13, we go all the way around. And I tell my students, I have learned everyone's first name by now, and so have you. And if you haven't, then your project for the next hour is to figure out what everyone's first name is, because I do not want to hear, in the course of this class, using passive voice in reference to something that has been said, as was said. Right? I want you to say, as Daryl said, or as Cheryl said. Right? So connecting them up by inducing a high degree early on of familiarity and intimacy and creating a sense of group enterprise turns out to be an important part of the way I teach now. I still don't, and I wouldn't invite any course other than the sophomore college classes into my home. There's just something qualitatively different about the SOCO experience, because you end up spending so much time with them anyway that there's nothing artificial about kind of pulling them in that last step. But it would be artificial to do it with an ordinary seminar, obviously. It's not the same type of experience. What else? I think I'm a kindler and gentler teacher than I was before I started to teach sophomore college. I'm more forgiving of human frailty, theirs and mine, probably. I'm less averse to demonstrating emotion, whereas I was very, very uncomfortable ever communicating anything that had any emotional content before sophomore college. Partly, as I said, because we're not trained as teachers. So, pedagogically, I don't know if it's better to be approachable or if it's better to be distant. I mean, I don't have any training in that. You kind of learn by doing. You learn by trial and error. And so those are a couple of ways that I think the sophomore college experience has impacted my other teaching, I think. Yes, Chris?
I was struck by your comments about trying to help your students become responsible citizens, which seems very important to me. I wonder if you could say a bit more about how you actually try to do that. Presumably it's not just exhortation.
Yeah. I do it, Chris, I think basically by storytelling, and I never tell them that part of their purpose or part of our purpose until the end. part of our collective purpose in this enterprise is to make us all better citizens. I don't tell them that, except at the end. But they always have questions about, what's it like to be in Washington? What's it like to be an assistant to the president? What's it like, right? And when I tell those stories or explain to them, I'm very self-conscious about trying to communicate to them the level of responsibility that I felt for the policy area for which I was responsible, that I was doing this not out of a purely academic love of knowing something about the Soviet Union or the post-Soviet Union. I did it because I felt that there were consequential choices to be made, and I felt that I had a responsibility not only to the president, but to the government of the United States to formulate the best policies that it could. So it frequently took the form of storytelling. And I did not and do not storytell when I teach sophomore college. We stick to the text and all that kind of stuff. But they know that outside the classroom experience, outside of class time, they're free to ask me anything about what it was like to do X, and I have found that those are the best kinds of opportunities. And then there are times when they'll just ask, how do you balance ambition? How do you balance ego, on the one hand, with what we all feel is a certain obligation to do good as well as we do well. And I will just kind of give them the benefit of my own experience and try to outline for them sometimes when I made a choice that ran more toward the value side or the ethical side of things, rather than the financial. But that's how I do it. I don't lecture at them. You have to be good citizens. I just wait until they're sufficiently intrigued by some aspect of policy making that there's a way for me to kind of capture it. But I've thought a lot about this because I think, just as I think experience is the best teacher, I think that the way in which I lead my life or the way in which you lead your life has an enormous impact on students that are close to us because they have to get reference points. They have to have models. So if you and I are saying something to them which is radically inconsistent with what we're doing, then we have a problem, and therefore they have a problem. So part of it is just trying to, make sure that those things stay aligned.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all very much.